to Sleepy Facts with Justin, where we explore the gentle mysteries of our past. Tonight, we're traveling back through time to the very beginnings of human civilization. Let your mind drift as we wander through ancient cities, long-forgotten temples, and the quiet wisdom of people who lived thousands of years ago. There's no need to remember every detail. Just let the words wash over you like a soft tide. If you drift away before the end, that's exactly as it should be. These ancient stories have waited thousands of years. They'll wait for you too. So settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin our peaceful journey through time. Imagine standing in the warm morning light, somewhere around 5,000 years ago. You're in southern Mesopotamia, between two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The air is still, carrying the scent of barley fields and date palms. This is where humanity first learned to live together in cities, in places with names like Uruk and Ur and Eridu. These early cities rose slowly from the flat plains. Their buildings were made of mud bricks, dried in the endless sunshine. Each brick was shaped by hand, placed carefully upon another. The walls grew thick and strong, creating temples that reached toward the sky, creating homes that sheltered families for generations. Life moved at a different pace then. People woke with the sun, walked barefoot on dusty streets. Their days were filled with simple rhythms: planting, harvesting, the steady work of living. At night, they would gather in courtyards, sharing meals, telling stories, watching stars wheel slowly overhead. The Sumerians were among the first to build these urban centers. They didn't know they were making history. They were simply solving problems, finding ways to store grain, to distribute water, to remember who owed what to whom. And in solving these quiet problems, they created something entirely new: the city. Imagine the marketplace in ancient Uruk. Tables laden with dates and fish. Pottery vessels filled with olive oil. The murmur of voices bargaining. Trading, the clink of weights on balanced scales. Everything moved slowly, deliberately. There was time for conversation, time for the small courtesies that make a community. Temples dominated these early cities, massive structures called ziggurats. Their stepped sides rose in levels, each one smaller than the one below. At the very top, a shrine where priests would commune with the gods. But even these grand buildings had a gentleness to them. Their corners were rounded by wind and rain, their surfaces softened by time. Children played in the shadows of these great structures, chasing each other through narrow alleyways. Their laughter echoed off mud brick walls, just as children's laughter does today. Some things remain constant across the millennia: the joy of play, the comfort of home, the rhythm of seasons passing. At twilight, when the day's heat finally broke, families would climb to their rooftops. These flat surfaces became gathering places. A breeze would rise from the rivers, cool and welcome. People would recline on woven mats, eating simple meals, watching the sky deepen from blue to purple to black. The night sounds of an ancient city were different from ours. No engines, no electricity humming through wires. Instead, the low sounds of animals settling, donkeys shifting in their stalls, dogs padding through streets, the occasional voice calling from one rooftop to another. And underneath everything, the eternal sound of the rivers, flowing, always flowing. Water was life in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates brought both abundance and uncertainty. Each spring, they would rise, sometimes gently, filling irrigation channels, feeding the fields, other times more violently, overflowing their banks, reminding everyone that nature cannot be fully controlled, only respected, worked with, understood. The Sumerians developed intricate canal systems, networks of ditches that carried water where it was needed. These waterways were maintained by the whole community. Everyone had a part to play, from the highest priest to the simplest farmer. All depended on the careful distribution of water. This shared dependency created bonds, a sense of collective purpose. Writing itself was born from this urban life, from the need to track grain in warehouses, to record offerings to temples. The earliest writing was simply pictures, pressed into soft clay with a reed. A picture of a bird meant bird, picture of grain meant grain, so simple, so practical, yet so revolutionary. Over time, these pictures became more abstract, more like symbols. They were pressed into the clay, creating wedge-shaped marks. We call this cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. Each mark was deliberate, each tablet carefully dried in the sun. These clay tablets have survived, telling us their stories even now, thousands of years later. Imagine a scribe at work, sitting cross-legged in the shade, a clay tablet resting on his knee, a reed stylus in his hand. He presses carefully, marking numbers, recording a transaction. Perhaps someone has brought barley to the temple. The amount must be noted. The scribe's hand moves slowly, each mark precise. This is sacred work, connecting the earthly and divine, keeping the order that makes civilized life possible. Now let us drift downstream, following another great river. The Nile flows through Egypt like a ribbon of life through desert. Its waters are dark and full of silt, carrying nutrients from deep in Africa. For thousands of years, the Nile's annual flood was as regular as breath. Each year, between June and September, the river would rise, covering the fields, leaving behind a layer of rich black soil. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, meaning black land, referring to this fertile soil. Beyond the river's reach, the red land, the desert, stretched endlessly, hostile and dry. But along the Nile's banks, life flourished. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and from these cities, pharaohs ruled, considered living gods, bridges between the human and divine. Egyptian life was deeply connected to cycles. The cycle of the Nile's flood, the cycle of planting and harvest, the cycle of the sun crossing the sky each day. These patterns brought comfort, predictability, a sense of order in the universe. Even death was seen as part of a cycle, not an ending, but a transformation, a journey to another realm. Imagine standing beside the Nile at dawn. The water is glassy and still, reflecting the pink and gold of sunrise. Papyrus plants grow thick along the banks, their stems tall and straight. umbrella-like tops nod gently in the morning breeze. A heron stands motionless in the shallows, watching for fish. Everything is peaceful, suspended in that perfect moment before the day truly begins. Fishermen are already at work. Their small boats made of bundled papyrus reeds. They cast nets with practiced movements. The nets sink beneath the surface, then rise again, hopefully full of silvery fish. These men know the river intimately. Every shallow, every current, every place where fish like to gather. Their knowledge has been passed down from father to son, generation after generation. Along the riverbank, women come to collect water, balancing clay jars on their heads. They move with effortless grace, their bare feet knowing every step of the path. They chat as they work, sharing news, discussing family matters. The river is a gathering place, a source not just of water, but of community, connection, the fabric of daily life. Egyptian homes were simple but functional. Built of mud brick, they stayed cool even in intense heat. Windows were small, placed high in walls, letting in light while keeping out the worst of the sun. Inside, furniture was minimal. Low stools, sleeping mats, a few storage baskets. Life was lived simply, focused on essentials. This simplicity had its own kind of peace. The wealthy lived differently. Their homes were larger, with multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards. Gardens grew in these protected spaces. Small pools reflected the sky. Trees provided shade, date palms, sycamore figs, acacias. Even in these grander homes, there was a sense of harmony with the environment, a working with nature rather than against it. Egyptian art shows us scenes of daily life. Farmers plowing fields, hunters in papyrus marshes, musicians playing at banquets. These images have a timeless quality. They were painted on tomb walls, meant to provide the deceased with familiar comforts in the afterlife. But they also preserve for us, across millennia, glimpses of how these people lived, what they valued, what brought them joy. Music was important in ancient Egypt. Harps and lutes, flutes and drums. Singers would perform at festivals, at religious ceremonies, at private celebrations. The melodies are lost to us now, but we can imagine them gentle and hypnotic, perhaps featuring the repeated patterns that appear so often in Egyptian art. Rhythms that matched the rhythms of the Nile, of planting and harvest, of life itself. Children in ancient Egypt played with toys remarkably similar to modern ones. Little wooden animals, balls made of leather or papyrus, dolls with movable limbs. They played games. Hopscotch, a game called senet that was like checkers. They swam in the Nile, though they were warned about crocodiles. They helped with household chores, learned trades from their parents. In so many ways, childhood then was like childhood now, filled with play and learning and gradual growth. The Egyptians were deeply spiritual. They saw gods everywhere, in the Nile itself, in the sun crossing the sky, in the ibis bird wading through marshes. Each god had their own story, their own sphere of influence. Ra, the sun god; Osiris, god of the afterlife; Isis, the protective mother goddess. These divine beings were woven into every aspect of life. They weren't distant. They were present, intimate, part of the family. Temples were the gods' homes on earth, massive structures of stone, their entrances flanked by enormous statues. Inside, the light grew dimmer. Pillars rose like forests, their capitals carved to look like lotus flowers or papyrus plants. Deep in the temple, in the innermost sanctuary, the god's statue resided. Only priests could enter this holy space. The rest remained in the outer courts, but everyone could feel the sacred presence. The process of building these temples was itself a meditation. Blocks of stone were quarried far upstream, floated down the Nile on barges. Thousands of workers, skilled craftsmen, guided each massive block into place. It took years, decades, sometimes generations. But time moved differently then. A lifetime spent building something that would last forever seemed a worthy exchange. At night, Egyptian families would gather on their rooftops, escaping the day's residual heat. The sky above was pierced with stars. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness. a river of light echoing the river of water below. They would tell stories, ancient tales of gods and heroes. These stories had been told for so long. No one remembered who first told them. They had always been timeless as the Nile itself. Let us journey now to another river valley, far to the east, where the Indus River flows through what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Here, around the same time, cities were rising in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Another sophisticated civilization was emerging. But this one remains mysterious, wrapped in silence, for we cannot read their writing. The cities of the Indus Valley were marvels of planning. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, these weren't haphazard settlements that grew organically over time. They were designed, laid out in careful grids. Their streets ran straight, intersecting at right angles, like a checkerboard, or perhaps like the orderly fields that surrounded them. What's most striking about these cities is their concern with cleanliness, with water management. Almost every home had a bathroom, connected to an elaborate drainage system. Covered drains ran beneath the streets, carrying waste away from living areas. This attention to sanitation wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. Not until the modern era would cities reclaim this level of public health awareness. Imagine walking through Mohenjo-daro on a quiet afternoon. The streets are wide and straight, lined with brick buildings, 2 or 3 stories tall. The bricks are all the same size, standardized, showing careful planning. Windows face inner courtyards rather than the street, giving privacy, creating peaceful spaces away from public areas. You pass the Great Bath, a public pool lined with waterproof bricks. Steps lead down into the water on both sides. This might have been used for ritual bathing. For ceremonies we can only guess at. The water would have been clear and cool, refreshing in the intense heat. People would descend slowly into the pool, perhaps saying prayers, performing rituals that made the physical act of bathing into something sacred. The Indus Valley people were skilled craftsmen. They made beautiful beads from carnelian, a red-orange stone. Each bead was carefully shaped, then drilled with remarkable precision. They also carved small seals from soapstone. These seals show animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceros, and above the animals, symbols, signs that might be writing. But we cannot read them. The Indus script remains undeciphered, keeping its secrets. This unknown writing tantalizes us. We have thousands of examples on seals, on pottery, short inscriptions, perhaps their names, or titles, or prayers. Scholars have tried for decades to decode them, comparing them to later scripts, to nearby languages. But the key remains hidden, and so the Indus people remain partially veiled. We can see how they lived, but we cannot hear their voices. Despite this silence, we can learn much from what they left behind. They traded widely. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian objects have been found in Indus cities. They exported cotton textiles, beads, jewelry, imported metals, precious stones. They were connected to a wider world, part of an ancient network of exchange that spanned thousands of miles. Their agriculture was sophisticated. They grew wheat and barley, but also cotton. Among the first people in the world to do so, they domesticated chickens, kept cattle, water buffalo, goats. They understood crop rotation, the importance of letting fields rest. Their relationship with the land was sustainable, working with natural cycles rather than exhausting resources. The Indus Valley cities show little evidence of warfare. No palaces, no grand temples, no obvious kings or priests. The houses, while varying in size, don't show the extreme disparities seen in other ancient cultures. Perhaps this was a more egalitarian society. Or perhaps their hierarchy was expressed in ways that don't survive in the archaeological record. We can only speculate, imagining. Life in these cities probably followed the rhythms of the agricultural calendar. Planting season, growing season, harvest. Each had its own demands, its own activities during the monsoon rains, when work in the fields was impossible. Perhaps this was when craftsmen focused on their finest work, when families gathered indoors, when when stories were told and retold, children would have played in those straight streets, running, laughing. They had toys, small carts pulled by oxen, whistles shaped like birds, spinning tops, simple pleasures that haven't changed. A child's delight in a spinning top is the same now as it was 4,000 years ago. Some joys are universal, timeless. The Indus civilization declined gradually. Around 1900 BCE, the cities began to change. Standards of construction declined. The careful urban planning wasn't maintained. People eventually abandoned the great cities, moving to smaller settlements. We're not sure why. Perhaps the rivers changed course. Perhaps the climate shifted. Perhaps trade networks collapsed, like the script. The reasons remain mysterious. But for nearly 1,000 years, these cities flourished. Their people lived lives of apparent order and comfort. They bathed in clean water, lived in well-planned homes, created beautiful objects, traded with distant lands, and then, slowly, quietly, their civilization faded, leaving behind brick ruins and undeciphered seals, leaving behind questions we may never fully answer. And there's something peaceful in that uncertainty, in accepting that some things cannot be known, that the past keeps some secrets we can imagine, we can wonder. We can picture life in those orderly streets, but we cannot know for certain. And perhaps that's all right. Perhaps the mystery itself is a kind of gift, an invitation to imagination, to dreams. Now our journey carries us east to the valley of the Yellow River, where Chinese civilization began its long, unbroken story. The Yellow River gets its name from the less fine yellowish soil that colors its water. This soil is fertile but unstable. The river has changed course many times, bringing both life and destruction. The earliest Chinese dynasties emerge from legend like mountains from morning mist. The Xia, possibly mythical, the Shang, definitely real, leaving behind remarkable evidence of their existence. And then the Zhou, ruling for nearly 800 years, the longest dynasty in Chinese history, each built upon what came before, creating continuity, tradition, a sense of connection across generations. The Shang dynasty, ruling from around 1600 to 1046 BCE, left us one of the most fascinating artifacts of the ancient world: oracle bones. These were turtle shells or cattle shoulder blades used for divination, for asking questions of the ancestors. Priests would carve questions into the bone, then apply heat. The bone would crack, and these cracks were interpreted as answers from the spirit world. Imagine the ceremony: a quiet courtyard in the royal palace, dawn light just beginning to touch the tops of walls. The diviner, dressed in ritual robes, holds a piece of carved bone. The question has been inscribed. Perhaps it asks whether the harvest will be good or whether the king should go to war, or whether an illness will improve. The diviner places a hot bronze rod against the bone, waits. The crack appears, sharp and sudden. Now comes the interpretation. These oracle bones are precious to us now, because the questions and sometimes the answers were written on them. This is the earliest Chinese writing, already quite sophisticated, showing that the script must have developed over a long period before. The characters are recognizable. Many are direct ancestors of modern Chinese characters, creating a written link across more than 3,000 years. Writing in China, as elsewhere, began with concrete things. A picture of the sun meant sun. A picture of a tree meant tree. But Chinese writing evolved in a unique direction. Characters became more abstract, more about combining elements to create meaning. The character for bright combines sun and moon. The character for forest is 3 trees together. This system is complex but beautiful, poetic in its logic. The ancient Chinese had deep reverence for ancestors. The dead were not gone. They remained present, involved in the lives of their descendants. They could help or harm, bring fortune or misfortune. Therefore, they must be honored, remembered, given offerings. This belief created powerful bonds across generations. The living and the dead existed in relationship, in dialogue. Families would maintain ancestral shrines, special rooms or areas where tablets bore the names of deceased family members. Offerings of food and drink were placed there regularly. Incense was burned. Prayers were said. This wasn't morbid. It was comforting, a sense that death doesn't sever family bonds, that love and respect continue beyond the grave. Life during the Shang dynasty centered on agriculture. Millet was the primary crop. Also wheat and rice in some areas. Farmers worked fields that belonged to nobles. Part of each harvest went to the ruler, part to local lords. What remained fed the farmer's family. This system created obligations running in both directions. The farmer owed labor and crops. The noble owed protection and justice. Villages were small, compact, homes built of pounded earth with thatched roofs. Inside, a hearth for cooking and warmth. Simple furniture, sleeping platforms, storage jars for grain. Life was focused on essentials, on family, on the endless cycle of seasons and agricultural work. There was a rhythm to it, a predictability that brought its own kind of peace. The Chinese developed bronze working to a very high level. Bronze vessels were used in rituals for offering food and wine to ancestors. These vessels are magnificent, covered with intricate designs, stylized dragons, geometric patterns, mysterious animal forms called tauri. Each piece required tremendous skill. The molds alone were engineering marvels. Multiple pieces fitting together perfectly to create a single vessel. Creating bronze was almost magical. Copper and tin, two relatively soft metals, combined to create something much harder, stronger. The process required fire, careful temperature control, precise timing. The molten bronze would be poured into clay molds. There was always an element of uncertainty. Had the mold been made correctly? Would it hold? Would the metal flow into every space? The moment of breaking open the mold, revealing what lay inside, must have been tense with anticipation. Music was important in ancient China. Bronze bells, stone chimes, drums, flutes made of bone or bamboo. Music accompanied rituals, marked important important occasions, entertained nobles at feasts. The Chinese believed music had power, that it could influence heaven and earth, bring harmony, proper order. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of maintaining cosmic balance. The concept of harmony was central to Chinese thought even in these early times. Harmony between humans and nature, between ruler and ruled, between past and present. This wasn't about everyone being the same. It was about different elements working together, complementing each other, like instruments in an ensemble. Each has its own voice, but all create something greater together. As night fell in ancient China, families would gather around hearth fires. The flames would cast dancing shadows. Outside, darkness would be complete. No streetlights, no electric glow, just stars overhead and the small circle of firelight, protecting, warming. People would talk quietly, telling stories, the same stories their parents told, that their grandparents told, stories that connected them to the past, that would carry forward into the future. Our journey now takes us across mountains and seas to the Greek peninsula, to a time before the classical Greece of Socrates and Plato. This is Mycenaean Greece, named for the city of Mycenae, existing from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. This is the Greece of legends, of heroes like Achilles and Odysseus. The Greece that laid foundations for all that came after. Mycenaean cities were built on hills, commanding views of the surrounding countryside. They were fortified, surrounded by walls so massive that later Greeks believed they must have been built by giants. These cyclopean walls, as they're called, were made of huge, irregular stones, fitted together without mortar. Some stones weigh several tons, yet they fit so precisely that nothing could slip between them. Imagine approaching Mycenae itself. The city crowns a hill. Its walls catch the afternoon sun, turning gold. You climb the steep path, your legs growing tired. Finally, you reach the Lion Gate, the main entrance. Two massive stones form the doorway, and above, a triangular stone carved with two lions flanking a column. face each other, rampant, eternal guardians. This is the oldest monumental sculpture in Europe, still watching after more than 3,000 years. Inside the walls, the palace complex rises, built on multiple levels, following the contours of the hill. The architecture is impressive, but somehow warm, human in scale. There's a great hall, the Megaron, with a central hearth. Smoke would rise through an opening in the roof. Around the hearth, nobles would gather, feasting, discussing politics, listening to bards sing of ancient deeds. The Mycenaeans left us writing, tablets inscribed in a script called Linear B. For decades after these tablets were discovered, no one could read them. Then, in 1952, an architect named Michael Ventris deciphered them. The language was Greek, an early form, but definitely Greek. These weren't literature or poetry. They were inventories, lists of goods, records of offerings, practical documents. But through them, we hear Mycenaean voices, speaking Greek 3,000 years ago. These tablets tell us about a complex economy. The palaces controlled enormous resources. They kept records of livestock, thousands of sheep, hundreds of cattle. They tracked textile production, how much wool was distributed to workers, how much cloth was produced. They recorded offerings to gods whose names we still know: Zeus, Poseidon, Dionysus. These gods were already ancient to the Mycenaeans. Trade was vital to Mycenaean prosperity. Their pottery has been found throughout the Mediterranean, in Egypt, in Italy, on Cyprus. They imported tin for bronze making, gold, ivory, amber from the distant north. Their ships crossed open waters, navigating by stars and experience. This required courage, skill, trust in the gods, and in one's own abilities. Life for common people was less grand than palace life, but still ordered, predictable. Farmers worked the land, growing wheat and barley, olives and grapes. Shepherds moved flocks between pastures, following seasonal patterns. Craftsmen produced pottery, textiles, tools. Everyone had a role, a place in the social order. This hierarchy was simply the way things were, accepted as natural as the changing seasons. Women in Mycenaean society had important roles. The tablets mention female workers, textile workers especially. Women ran households, managed slaves and servants. Some held religious positions. Though this was a patriarchal society, women weren't entirely without power or status. They moved within their sphere, exercising influence in ways both subtle and direct. Religion permeated daily life. Small shrines stood in homes, in fields, at crossroads. People left offerings, a bit of wine, some grain, a small clay figurine. These weren't elaborate ceremonies, just simple acts of devotion, acknowledgement of the divine presence in the world. The gods weren't distant abstractions. They were forces that might help or harm, better to maintain good relations through regular attention. The landscape itself was sacred. Certain mountains were holy. Certain caves housed divine power. Springs and rivers had their spirits. Trees, especially ancient olive trees, commanded respect. Walking through this landscape, the Mycenaeans moved through a world alive with meaning, with presence. Nothing was merely physical. Everything had spiritual dimension. Children grew up learning their future roles. Boys trained for war if noble, for trade if common. Girls learned household management, weaving, the countless skills needed to run a home. But there was also play, swimming in the sea, climbing trees, exploring ruins already ancient even then. Childhood was preparation for adulthood, but also its own time. A season of relative freedom before responsibilities descended. The Mycenaean world eventually collapsed around 1100 BCE. The palaces burned. The complex administration vanished. Writing was forgotten. What caused this collapse remains debated. Earthquakes, invaders, internal conflict, climate change, probably some combination. The details are lost. What matters is that a brilliant civilization faded, leaving behind ruins and legends. But those legends persisted, passed down through centuries of Greek Dark Ages. By the time Homer composed the Iliad and Odyssey, probably in the 8th century BCE. The Mycenaean age was distant past, but the stories remained, stories of heroes and gods, of wars and homecomings, and these stories, born in Mycenaean courts, have never died. They live still, whispered in the ruins, carried on the Mediterranean wind. Now let us cross an ocean to a different hemisphere entirely, to the steaming jungles of southern Mexico, where the Olmec civilization flourished from around 1500 to 400 BCE. This was the first major civilization in Mesoamerica. The mother culture, as it's sometimes called, that influenced all who came after. The Olmec built their cities in lowlands, along the Gulf Coast, in regions of intense rainfall and lush vegetation. The jungle grows quickly there, aggressively, always trying to reclaim cleared space. Living in this environment required constant vigilance, constant work, but it also provided abundance. Rich soil, rivers full of fish, forests full of game. The Olmec are perhaps best known for the colossal heads they carved. Massive sculptures of stone, some weighing up to 50 tons. Each head is unique, showing an individual face, probably a ruler. These faces are serene, powerful. Their eyes gaze out across centuries, their mouths set in expressions we can only interpret. Are they stern, peaceful, contemplative? Each viewer sees something slightly different. Creating these heads required tremendous effort. The stone was basalt, volcanic rock. It had to be quarried from mountains 50 miles away. 50 miles through jungle, across rivers. Teams of workers moved these immense blocks. We don't know exactly how. Perhaps on log rollers, perhaps on rafts during the wet season when rivers swelled. However, they managed it. It demonstrates remarkable organization, shared purpose, the ability to coordinate hundreds of people toward a single goal. Once the stone reached its destination, sculptors would work it, gradually revealing the face hidden within. Using stone tools, they would chip away, pecking and grinding, week after week, month after month. The work was meditative, repetitive. The sculptor and the stone existing in dialogue, the stone yielding slowly, reluctantly, until finally a face emerged, a presence, a permanent record of someone who once lived. The Olmec developed a complex religious system. They worshipped a jaguar deity, part human, part jaguar. This being appears again and again in Olmec art, in carvings, in jade figures. The jaguar was the most powerful predator in their environment, lord of the jungle, able to hunt by day or night, able to climb trees and swim rivers, a perfect symbol of power and mystery. Jade was precious to the Olmec, more valuable than gold. They carved it into figurines, pendants, masks. The stone is extremely hard. Carving it required patience, skill, the use of abrasives like sand and water. The result was worth the effort. Jade has a luminous quality. It seems to glow from within, smooth and cool to the touch, almost alive. Olmec cities were ceremonial centers, with pyramids and plazas, courts for playing ritual ball games. These ball courts were ice-shaped, with sloping sides. The game was played with a heavy rubber ball. Players couldn't use their hands, only hips, knees, elbows. The game had ritual significance, possibly reenacting cosmic struggles. The movement of celestial bodies. We don't know all the rules, but we know it was important, central to Olmec culture. Daily life followed agricultural rhythms. The Olmec grew maize, beans, squash, the famous three sisters that formed the basis of Mesoamerican agriculture. These three crops support each other. Beans fix nitrogen in soil. Corn provides a structure for beans to climb. Squash spreads across the ground, shading soil, retaining moisture. Together they create a balanced system, sustainable, productive. The tropical climate meant outdoor living was common. Homes were simple, probably pole and thatch structures. They wouldn't survive in the archaeological record, but they suited the environment, allowing air circulation, staying cooler than solid walls would. During the day, much of life happened outside, in shade, in courtyards, away from the sun's intensity. Rain was a constant presence. In the wet season, season. It could fall for hours, days. The sound of rain on palm thatch would have been the soundtrack to daily life. A steady percussion, sometimes gentle, sometimes torrential. Rivers would rise, flooding low areas, but also depositing new silt, renewing the soil. Rain was both challenge and blessing. Like so much in life, the Olmec developed writing, or at least a precursor to writing. Symbols carved on stone. Some represent sounds. Some represent ideas. We can't read most of it, but its existence shows sophisticated thought. The desire to record, to communicate across time and space, to make the transient permanent. They also understood astronomy. They tracked the movements of planets, of Venus especially. They developed a calendar based on careful observations over generations. This knowledge was practical, helping determine when to plant, when to harvest, but it was also spiritual. The heavens and earth were connected. What happened above affected what happened below. At night, in the jungle, darkness is absolute. No light pollution. Stars blaze overhead. The Milky Way cuts across the sky like a river of light. The Olmec looked up at these same stars, saw the same patterns, but interpreted them through their own cosmology, their own stories. The stars were gods, ancestors, guides through the darkness. Eventually, Olmec civilization declined. Their cities were abandoned, partially reclaimed by jungle. Why this happened remains uncertain. Climate change, perhaps. Political upheaval. Shifts in trade routes. But their influence continued. The cultures that followed, Maya, Aztec, all built on Olmec foundations. The word jaguar deity evolved into later gods. The ball game continued. The reverence for jade. The Olmec disappeared, but never truly ended. They live on in what came after. Our journey now brings us to an island, Crete, floating in the Mediterranean, between Greece and Africa and Asia. This is the Bronze Age, around 2000 to 1450 BCE, and here the Minoan civilization flourished. Named after the legendary King Minos. This was a culture of palaces and frescoes, beauty and mystery, of questions that still puzzle us. The palace at Knossos is the most famous Minoan site, a sprawling complex of rooms and corridors. Some have called it labyrinthine. Perhaps this is where the legend of the labyrinth began. The palace grew over centuries, each generation adding, modifying, until it became a maze of spaces, each serving some function we can only guess at. What strikes you immediately about Minoan art is its lightness, its joy. The frescoes that decorated palace walls show scenes of nature, dolphins leaping through waves, blue monkeys playing in gardens, flowers blooming in profusion. There's a celebration of life here, of the natural world, a sensibility very different from the stern militarism of other ancient cultures. One famous fresco shows bull leaping, a figure, arms extended, some assaulting over a charging bull. Other figures wait at the bull's head and tail, ready to assist. This was probably a ritual, perhaps a coming-of-age ceremony, dangerous certainly, requiring courage, timing, trust. Was it religious, athletic, both? We can only imagine. The Minoans were great sailors. Crete's location made it a natural hub for Mediterranean trade. Minoan ships carried goods in all directions, to Egypt, to the Near East, to the Greek mainland, to the Western Mediterranean. They brought home treasures, ideas, stories from distant places. This maritime culture influenced everything. The openness, the absorption of outside influences, the wealth. Minoan cities were unusual for their time. They had no fortification walls, at least not substantial ones. This suggests either remarkable confidence, or perhaps that their defense was their navy, keeping threats at sea, far from shore. Or perhaps Minoan society was less warlike, more peaceful than its neighbors. The archaeological evidence suggests less emphasis on warfare, more on trade and religion and art. Religion was clearly important. And here's something fascinating. It seems to have been centered on goddesses. Female deities dominate Minoan religious art. A goddess with snakes, a goddess with poppies, mountain goddesses, We don't know their names. The Minoan language, called Linear A, remains undeciphered. But the images tell us these divine feminine powers were central to Minoan spirituality. Women may have held higher status in Minoan society than in other ancient cultures. They appear prominently in art, dressed elaborately, participating in rituals, present at important events. This doesn't necessarily mean equality in the modern sense, but it suggests a society with different gender dynamics than patriarchal cultures like Rome or classical Greece. Minoan fashion was distinctive. Women wore long tiered skirts, tight bodices, their hair elaborately styled. Men wore kilts, sometimes loincloths. Both sexes seem to have valued physical fitness, slender waists, athletic builds. Again, this comes through in the art. Young people engaging in ritual, sport, dance, the body celebrated, not hidden or mortified. The palaces served multiple functions. Religious ceremonies happened there, but also administration, storage, craft production. They were hubs of activity, the beating hearts of Minoan society. Through them flowed goods, information, people. They coordinated the complex operations necessary to maintain civilization, to feed populations, to conduct trade, to honor the gods. Storage rooms in the palaces held enormous jars, called pith, taller than a person. These contained oil, wine, grain, dried fish, the accumulated wealth of the land, carefully recorded, distributed as needed. This system required trust, record keeping, social organization. The tablets recording these transactions, written in Linear A, cannot tell us their stories. The script keeps its silence. Life outside the palaces was simpler. Villages scattered across the island, farming the fertile valleys, tending olive groves, vineyards, herding goats and sheep in the hills. The island is mountainous, with narrow coastal plains. So agriculture required terracing, careful use of available land. But the climate is kind, warm, with winter rains and summer drought. The rhythm of Mediterranean seasons. The sea was always present. You're never far from water on Crete. Fishermen worked the coasts, their catches supplementing agricultural products the sea provided. But it could also destroy. Crete sits in an earthquake zone. The ground occasionally shakes, reminding everyone of powers beyond human control. Around 1450 BCE, Minoan civilization was disrupted. Some palaces burned, others were damaged. What happened is debated. The volcanic explosion of Thera, an island to the north, may have caused tsunamis, earthquakes, ashfall, or perhaps it was invasion. Mycenaeans from the mainland. After this, Minoan culture continued, but changed, never quite regaining its earlier glory. Eventually, the palaces were abandoned. The sophisticated culture faded. The writing was forgotten. For thousands of years, the ruins lay silent until archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos in 1900, bringing the Minoans back into human consciousness. Now we can walk through the palace, see the frescoes, and wonder, what were they like? These people who painted dolphins and lilies, who leapt over bulls, who built without walls. What did they believe? What did they dream? The ruins whisper, but never quite answer. We travel now to Anatolia, the great peninsula between the Mediterranean and Black Sea, the land bridge between Europe and Asia. Here, from around 1600 to 1178 BCE, the Hittite Empire rose, flourished, and fell. They were one of the great powers of the Bronze Age, trading and fighting with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria. Yet for centuries after their fall, they were forgotten, known only from brief mentions in the Bible. The Hittite capital was Hattusa, built on a rocky ridge in central Anatolia. At about 33 feet elevation, winters there were cold, summers hot and dry. The city was heavily fortified with massive walls, towers, gates. This was clearly a military power, but also a literate culture, a people of both sword and stylus. The great discovery came in the early 1900s. Archaeologists found the royal archives. Thousands of clay tablets diplomatic language of the time. These tablets revealed an entire civilization, treaties, letters, laws, religious texts. The Hittites could suddenly speak again across the millennia. One remarkable tablet records a treaty between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. This followed the famous Battle of Kadesh, where the two empires clashed inconclusively. The treaty established peace, defined borders, promised mutual defense. It's one of the earliest known peace treaties, and copies survive in both Egypt and Hattusa. The same text in different languages, different scripts, showing how international relations were conducted 3,000 years ago. The Hittites were masters of diplomacy. They had to be surrounded by rivals. They couldn't fight everyone simultaneously. So they made alliances, arranged royal marriages, exchanged gifts and letters with other courts. This diplomatic correspondence is fascinating. Great kings addressing each other as brothers, negotiating over trade routes, complaining about insults. Very human concerns transcending the centuries. They were also innovators in metallurgy. The Hittites were among the first to smelt iron on an industrial scale. Before this, the Bronze Age. Weapons and tools were bronze, but iron, when properly worked, is harder, more durable. The Hittites guarded this technology, controlled its spread. Iron tools and weapons gave them advantage, both military and economic. Imagine a Hittite smithy, deep in the city, away from wooden buildings. The forge glows red, the smith works bellows, heating iron ore with charcoal. The temperature must be carefully controlled. Too cool and the iron won't smelt. Too hot and it becomes brittle. This required skill developed over years, knowledge passed from master to apprentice. The secrets of fire and metal. Hittite law was surprisingly sophisticated. We have law codes preserved on tablets. They cover everything from theft to assault, from marriage to property disputes. The punishments were often fines rather than harsh physical penalties. There's a sense of proportionality, a desire for justice rather than mere vengeance. Of course, this applied within the the social hierarchy. Slaves and commoners weren't equal before the law. But even so, there was structure, rules, not arbitrary power. Religion was central to Hittite life. They worshipped many gods, 1,000 gods and goddesses. They said they absorbed deities from conquered peoples, building a vast pantheon. The storm god was particularly important, bringing rain, controlling weather, essential in a land dependent on seasonal precipitation for agriculture. Religious festivals marked the year. The king himself served as high priest, performing rituals, making offerings. These ceremonies could last days, processions, sacrifices, sacred meals, the entire court participating. Religion and state were inseparable. The king's role was to maintain cosmic order, to ensure the gods' favor. On this depended the empire's prosperity, its survival. Outside the capital, life was agricultural. Villages clustered around springs and streams, fields of barley and wheat, vineyards, orchards, herds of sheep and goats. The landscape is rugged, with mountains and high plateaus, but the valleys are fertile, especially when irrigation brought water where needed. Farmers worked land they didn't own, owing taxes and labor to local lords. To the king, this was the foundation of the economy, the base supporting everything else. Hittite homes were simple: stone foundations, mud brick walls, flat roofs. In winter, people slept indoors, near hearths. In summer, on rooftops where it was cooler. Life was lived communally. Extended families sharing space. Multiple generations under one roof. This was normal, expected. The individual was less important than the family unit, the clan, the network of obligations and support. Women in Hittite society had certain rights. They could own property, could divorce, could inherit. This doesn't mean equality, but compared to some ancient cultures, Hittite women had legal personality. They weren't simply property themselves. Queens could be powerful. Some even ruled as regents. Most women's lives centered on household management, child rearing, textile production, but within that sphere, they held authority. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire collapsed. Part of the general Bronze Age collapse that affected the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Cities burned, trade networks broke down, writing ceased. The reasons are debated: climate change, drought, migrations of displaced peoples, internal rebellion, system failure, probably multiple causes reinforcing each other, creating a cascade of catastrophe. Hattusa was abandoned. The great walls crumbled. Wind and weather wore at the buildings. Earth covered the tablets. For 3,000 years, they lay buried. The Hittites became a footnote, a name without context, until archaeology brought them back. Now we know their laws, read their letters, understand their struggles. They live again in our historical consciousness, their silence broken, their story told once more. South of Egypt, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, lay the land the Egyptians called Ta-Seti, the land of the bow. We know it as Nubia. This was a civilization that existed alongside Egypt for thousands of years, sometimes independent, sometimes conquered, always distinct, with its own culture, its own kingdoms, its own remarkable story. Nubia's history is deeply intertwined with Egypt's, but for too long, Nubia was seen only through Egyptian eyes, as a source of resources, gold especially, ivory, ebony, incense, Egypt's southern frontier. But Nubia was much more than that. It was a civilization in its own right, with periods of power when Nubian kings ruled Egypt itself. The 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs. The land of Nubia is harsh. The Nile flows through desert, creating a narrow ribbon of green. Cataracts, rapids where granite rocks break the river's smooth flow, made navigation difficult. These natural barriers created boundaries, separating regions, creating distinct zones of settlement. The Nubians adapted to this challenging environment, becoming skilled navigators, learning the moods of their difficult river. Nubian civilization goes back to the Neolithic. Early kingdoms emerged around 2400 BCE. The kingdom of Kerma. Its Its capital featured massive mud brick structures called diffufas. These were religious buildings or administrative centers rising from the desert like small mountains, visible for miles, asserting human presence in the vast landscape. Kerma was wealthy. Its cemeteries reveal this. Large tumulus burials covered with white quartz pebbles that gleamed in the sun. Inside, the dead were accompanied by astonishing grave goods, pottery, jewelry, weapons, sacrificed animals, even sacrificed humans, servants to accompany the ruler into the afterlife. This was a hierarchical society, with rulers commanding tremendous resources and loyalty. Nubian pottery was distinctive, beautiful, thin-walled vessels, some with black tops and red bodies, others entirely black with a lustrous surface. The potters achieved these effects through careful control of firing, the amount of oxygen, the temperature. Each piece required skill, experience, and understanding of how clay and fire interact. Gold was abundant in Nubia. The name itself may derive from nub, the Egyptian word for gold. Nubian gold flowed north to Egypt, enriching pharaohs, adorning temples and tombs. This created a complex relationship. Egypt desired Nubian gold, sometimes taking it through trade, sometimes through conquest. The border between the two lands was contested, shifting over centuries. During Egypt's New Kingdom, Nubia was conquered, colonized. Egyptian culture spread south. Temples to Egyptian gods were built. The local elite adopted Egyptian customs, Egyptian language for centuries. Nubia was Egyptianized, but identity persisted. Underneath the Egyptian veneer, Nubian traditions survived, waiting for opportunity. That opportunity came during Egypt's third intermediate period, when Egypt fragmented into competing kingdoms. Nubia reunified under the kingdom of Kush, based at Napata, near the Fourth Cataract. The Kushite kings grew powerful, and around 750 BCE, they moved north, conquering Egypt itself, establishing the 25th dynasty. Nubian pharaohs ruling from Memphis and Thebes. These Nubian pharaohs saw themselves as restorers of proper tradition. They were devout, building and restoring temples, following ancient rituals perhaps more carefully than Egyptian rulers had done recently. They commissioned traditional Egyptian art and architecture, but influences from Nubia remained in their names, in certain artistic conventions, in the double uraeus cobra, symbolizing rule over both Egypt and Nubia. Their rule lasted less than a century. The Assyrian Empire, armed with iron weapons, invaded Egypt. The Kushites withdrew, retreating to Nubia. They didn't disappear. Instead, they built a new center at Meroe, far to the south. Here, beyond Egypt's reach, Kushite civilization continued for another 1,000 years. Meroe was extraordinary, a city of pyramids. Yes, the Kushites built pyramids, smaller and steeper than Egyptian pyramids, but pyramids nonetheless, continuing an ancient tradition. The royal cemetery at Meroe contains dozens of these pyramids, standing in rows, some still intact, others weathered and crumbled, all pointing toward the sky, marking the resting places of kings and queens. Queens were particularly important in Meroitic culture. The title Candake, or Candace, referred to queen mothers. Some ruled in their own right. These warrior queens led armies, commissioned monuments, conducted diplomacy. When the Romans expanded south from Egypt, they encountered a Kushite kingdom ruled by Queen Ammonirnas. She fought them fiercely. The Romans never conquered Kush. Eventually, they negotiated a treaty. Roman might have met its match. The Meroites developed their own script, influenced by Egyptian hieroglyphs, but distinct. We can read the letters, the sounds, but we don't understand the language. So, like the Indus script, Meroitic writing remains undeciphered. A voice we can hear, but not comprehend. This silence frustrates us, but it also preserves mystery. These people had thoughts they wrote down, stories they told, and we cannot access them. Not yet, perhaps never. Iron was important to Meroe. The city had extensive slag heaps, evidence of iron smelting on an industrial scale. Trees were cut for charcoal. Ore was smelted, metal was forged into tools and weapons. The landscape around Meroe still shows the impact. Areas once forested, now bare. The cost of civilization, the price of technology. Eventually, around 350 CE, the kingdom of Kush declined. Meroe was abandoned. Why remains unclear. Climate change, perhaps. Desertification, reducing agricultural yields. Or perhaps the rise of Aksum, a rival kingdom to the southeast. Or internal problems, the failure of institutions. Whatever the cause, the last great Nubian kingdom faded. The pyramids stood empty, the cities silent. Wind carried sand over roads and walls. Another civilization joined the procession of vanished peoples. Now let us turn to the Mediterranean coast, to the narrow strip between sea and mountains, where the Phoenician cities rose: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. These were never united into an empire. Each city was independent, often rivals, but they shared culture, language, and above all, a relationship with the sea. The Phoenicians were the Mediterranean's greatest sailors. From roughly 1,500 to 300 BCE, their ships traveled farther than anyone else's. They knew every port, every current, every seasonal wind. They sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Atlantic, north to Britain, perhaps even circumnavigating Africa. Though this last is debated, what isn't debated is their mastery of maritime life. Their ships were built from cedar, the famous cedars of Lebanon. These trees grew in the mountains above the coastal cities, tall and straight, their wood resistant to rot, perfect for shipbuilding. The timber itself was valuable, exported to Egypt and Mesopotamia, lands with few trees for temple construction, palace doors, royal furniture. The cedars were a resource and a symbol of these mountainous slopes, this green land between sea and desert. Phoenician cities were merchants, traders. They produced goods that others desired. Purple dye especially. This came from murex snails, harvested from the sea. Each snail produced only a drop of dye, thousands were needed for even small amounts. The process was smelly, involved, but the result was extraordinary. A purple dye that didn't fade, that actually brightened with sun and washing. This Tyrian purple became synonymous with royalty, with wealth only the richest could afford it. Imagine the dyeing workshops, piles of murex shells, the distinctive smell, not pleasant, hanging over the work area, workers extracting the dye glands, preparing the dye baths, dipping cloth, checking the color, each batch slightly different, each piece of dyed fabric valuable, the result of enormous labor. This was Tyre's gift to the world, beauty from ugly process, value from patience and skill. The Phoenicians were also master craftsmen. They worked in glass, in metal, in ivory. Their luxury goods traveled throughout the Mediterranean, to Greece, to Italy, to Assyria. Phoenician artisans combined influences from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from their own traditions, creating hybrid styles, cosmopolitan art reflecting their position as intermediaries, as bridges between cultures. But perhaps their greatest gift was simpler. The alphabet, the Phoenician script, was revolutionary. Earlier writing systems required hundreds of signs. Learning to read and write took years. But the Phoenician alphabet had just 22 letters, each representing a consonant sound. This was so much simpler, so much more accessible. The Greeks adopted it, adding vowels, creating their alphabet, which led to the Latin alphabet, which you're reading now. In a very real sense, we owe our writing system to Phoenician merchants who needed an efficient way to keep records, to write contracts, to communicate across distances. Life in a Phoenician city was focused on the harbor. Ships came and went, bringing goods from distant places, grain from Sicily, tin from Spain, amber from the north. Each cargo was unloaded, stored, traded, loaded onto other ships, bound for other ports. The harbor was noise and movement, sailors speaking different languages, the splash of oars, the creak of ropes, the calls of merchants, all the sounds of commerce. The cities themselves were densely packed, built on islands or headlands. For defense, streets were narrow, climbing from the harbor to higher ground. Multi-story buildings, sometimes 6 or 7 stories tall, made the most of limited space. Inside, families lived in close quarters, but the roof was open space where one could breathe, see the sky, watch ships in the harbor below. Religion for the Phoenicians centered on gods connected to nature, to the agricultural cycle. Baal, the storm god, who brought rain; Astarte, goddess of fertility and war; Melkart, the god of Tyre. Each city had its patron deity. Temples were important, but religion was also personal. Household shrines, small offerings, daily acknowledgement of divine presence in the world. The Phoenicians established colonies throughout the Mediterranean, trading posts that sometimes grew into cities. The most famous is Carthage, founded by Tyre around 814 BC. On the North African coast, Carthage would eventually become a great power in its own right, rivaling Rome. This pattern of colonization spread Phoenician culture, language, the alphabet, gods. All traveled west with the colonists. Life at sea was both routine and dangerous. Sailors knew the rhythms, the work of sailing, adjusting ropes, managing the sail, rowing when necessary, but danger was always close. Storms could rise quickly. The ship could founder. Pirates lurked near coasts, watching for vulnerable merchants. Each voyage required courage, faith in one's skills, in one's shipmates, in the gods. Navigation relied on accumulated knowledge. Phoenician pilots learned landmarks, the shape of coastlines, the location of harbors. They watched stars at night, the sun's position by day. They understood seasonal winds, currents. This wasn't written down. It was oral knowledge, passed from experienced sailors to young ones. A tradition of practical wisdom, built over generations. Eventually, the independent Phoenician cities lost their autonomy, conquered by Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, then Alexander. Carthage lasted longer, but finally fell to Rome after the 3 Punic Wars. The Phoenician world ended. Their cities became the language faded, but their legacy remained in the alphabet, in the colonies that became Roman cities, in the maritime knowledge that passed to Greeks and Romans. The Phoenicians sailed into history, and though they vanished, their wake still laps against Mediterranean shores. Now we turn to a people feared throughout the ancient world, the Assyrians from northern Mesopotamia. Their empire, at its height around 650 BCE, stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean to the mountains of Iran. This was a military machine, efficient, ruthless, but also a sophisticated civilization with libraries and art, with laws and administration more complex than their reputation suggests. The Assyrian homeland was around the city of Ashur, on the Tigris River. The land was less fertile than southern Mesopotamia. Perhaps this necessity, this hardship, contributed to Assyrian militarism. They had to take what they couldn't easily produce. But this is speculation. What's certain is that from early on, Assyria was organized for war. Assyrian kings were warriors first. They led armies personally, campaigned season after season. Their inscriptions boast of victories, of cities conquered, of enemies destroyed. These texts are brutal, describing executions and deportations in graphic detail. This wasn't just propaganda. It was policy. Terror was a weapon. If resistance led to horrific consequences, perhaps cities would surrender, save themselves, submit to Assyrian rule. But there was more to Assyria than military might. The palace at Nineveh, built by King Sennacherib, was magnificent. Massive gates flanked by human-headed winged bulls. Lamashu, these guardian spirits were carved from single blocks of stone, each weighing up to 30 tons. They had 5 legs, so they appeared to stand still when viewed from front, to walk when viewed from the side. Their faces were human, bearded, serene, their bodies bulls, their wings like eagles, a combination of human intelligence, bovine strength, eagle's divine connection. The palace walls were lined with relief sculptures, carved limestone panels showing scenes of war and hunt, kings besieging cities, archers and spearmen in battle, chariots charging. These reliefs are astonishingly detailed. Individual soldiers, each face different, each garment rendered carefully, trees and rivers, camps and equipment, everything documented in stone. But not all scenes were violent. There were also gardens, processions, religious ceremonies. One famous panel shows Ashurbanipal and his queen dining in a garden, musicians playing, servants attending. It's peaceful, luxurious, a glimpse of court life when the wars were far away, when the empire was secure, when one could relax among vines and flowers. Ashurbanipal was notable for another reason. He created a library at Nineveh. He collected tablets from throughout his empire, thousands of them, literature, science, religion, history, mathematics, medicine. This library was one of the ancient world's great repositories of knowledge. When Nineveh fell, the library burned. But fired clay tablets don't burn. They harden. Archaeologists have recovered thousands, including the Epic of Gilgamesh. Our most complete version comes from Ashurbanipal's library. Assyrian administration was sophisticated. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by appointed officials. They reported to the king, sending regular dispatches. The royal correspondence archives show this system in action. Governors reporting on harvests, on security threats, on local disputes, the king issuing orders, guidance. The whole empire connected by messengers on royal roads. Deportation was an Assyrian policy. When regions rebelled, populations were moved, resettled far from their homelands. This broke local power structures, prevented organized resistance. It was cruel, separating people from ancestral lands, from familiar places. But from the Assyrian perspective, it maintained order. Hundreds of thousands were moved this way. The northern kingdom of Israel, for example, was depopulated, its people scattered. The famous lost tribes. Daily life for common people in the Assyrian Empire was agricultural, the same as elsewhere in Mesopotamia. Farming, herding, the eternal rhythms of planting and harvest. most people never saw the wars, never experienced the brutality described in royal inscriptions. They paid their taxes, provided labor when required, otherwise lived as their ancestors had, in small villages, extended families working the land. Cities within the empire were diverse. Because of deportation, because of trade, many languages could be heard in markets. Many ethnic groups lived side by side. This cosmopolitanism was typical of empires. The capital especially attracted people from everywhere, seeking opportunities, bringing skills, creating a multicultural urban environment. Religion remained central. The Assyrians worshipped the traditional Mesopotamian gods. Ashur, the national god, from whom the country took its name. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, the great gods who had been worshipped for millennia. Temples received offerings, supported priesthoods. Religious festivals punctuated the year. These continuities connected the empire to ancient traditions. The Assyrian army was the most advanced of its time. They used iron weapons extensively, had specialized units, archers, cavalry, siege engineers. They developed technologies for taking cities, battering rams, siege towers. They could overcome walls, bridge rivers, operate in mountains and deserts. This military sophistication was key to their success. But even the mightiest empire falls. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes besieged Nineveh. The city fell, was destroyed so thoroughly that it was lost for centuries. The Assyrian Empire collapsed rapidly. Within a few years, gone, the military machine broken, the administration dissolved, the cities burned and abandoned. The ruins lay silent for 2,500 years, until 19th century archaeologists began excavating, revealing the lamassu, the relief panels, the libraries, bringing Assyria back into human consciousness. Now we can see their art, read their texts, understand their empire. They were fierce, yes, but also cultured, complex, human. Their story is part of our shared past, a chapter in the long, complicated narrative of civilization seasons marked larger rhythms: spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter rest. These cycles dominated agricultural societies. Everyone understood them, lived by them. Spring brought hope, the return of warmth, of green things growing. Fields were prepared, seeds planted, each seed an act of faith that the earth would provide. Summer meant maintenance, weeding, watering if possible, watching crops grow, hoping for adequate rain, but not too much, praying to whatever gods governed weather and harvest. The sun beat down. Work began early, before the worst heat, resumed in late afternoon when temperatures moderated. Autumn was harvest time, the culmination of the year's work. Families worked together, cutting grain, gathering it, thrashing, winnowing. The harvest determined whether the winter would be comfortable or lean. This was celebration time, but also anxiety. Had enough been grown? Would it store properly? Would it last until spring? Winter brought rest from field work, but not idleness. There were tools to repair, shelters to maintain. In cold climates, people stayed indoors more, gathered around fires. This was time for craft work, for weaving and woodworking, for storytelling and music, for the social bonds that sustained communities through dark months. Religious observances marked the year. Festivals for planting, for harvest, for the new year, for various gods. These weren't separate from daily life. They were woven into it, breaks from routine, occasions for community gathering, for feasting, for renewal of faith and fellowship. Religion and daily life were inseparable. Birth, marriage, death. These life transitions were marked with ceremony. With ritual, they bound individuals to community, to tradition, to the long chain of generations. A birth was celebrated, a new life entering the world, continuing the family, the clan. Marriage created alliances, brought families together, established new households. Death required proper ritual. The deceased needed to be prepared, mourned, buried, or cremated according to custom. This wasn't just for the dead. It was for the living, processing grief, maintaining connection. Ancient peoples often believed the dead remained present, required offerings, attention. The boundary between life and death was permeable, not the absolute separation we often imagine. Sleep patterns differed from ours. Ancient peoples likely slept in segments, falling asleep shortly after dark, waking after several hours, remaining awake for an hour or two, then sleeping again until dawn. This segmented sleep was natural, normal. The quiet, wakeful period might be used for meditation, for intimacy, for quiet contemplation. Total sleep duration was probably longer than modern averages, perhaps 7 to 8 hours, sometimes more in winter, less in summer when nights were short, without artificial light. There was little reason to stay awake in darkness. Sleep came naturally, without the anxiety and sleep disorders so common in our overstimulated world. Dreams were significant, messages from gods, from ancestors, prophecies, warnings. People paid attention to dreams, sought their meaning, consulted priests or seers for interpretation. Dreams were another way the divine communicated with the human, another thread connecting the visible and invisible worlds. Health was understood differently. Illness might be divine punishment or spiritual imbalance, or practical causes like bad food or water. Treatment combined practical remedies, herbs, and procedures with spiritual healing. Prayer and offerings, the body and spirit weren't separate. Health required attention to both. Pain was ever present. Toothaches, joint pain, injuries from work and accidents. There were remedies, some effective, some not, but chronic pain was simply part of life, something to be endured, worked through. This doesn't mean people were indifferent. They suffered, but suffering was expected, not something that could necessarily be eliminated. Old age, when achieved, brought status. The elderly possessed knowledge, experience, memory of earlier times. They were resources, counselors, in cultures venerating ancestors. The elderly were already approaching that revered state, already becoming bridges between present and past, between earth and was local, bounded by walking distance, perhaps a day's journey in any direction. This created deep rootedness, intimate knowledge of local landscape, but also limited perspective. The world beyond was known through stories, through travelers' tales, largely imaginary. Yet there was also movement. Traders traveled, armies marched, pilgrims journeyed to sacred sites. These travelers brought back news, goods, ideas, creating connections across distances, weaving the ancient world into networks of exchange, information spreading slowly but steadily, culture influencing culture. Language itself was diverse. A village might speak one language, the next valley over something different. Major languages, Akkadian, Egyptian, Chinese, Greek, spread through trade and conquest. But local dialects persisted, creating layers of communication, translation, misunderstanding, the complexity of human speech. And underneath everything, the fundamental human experiences: love, fear, joy, sorrow, hope, despair. These haven't changed. A parent's love for a child was the same then as now. The grief of loss, the satisfaction of work completed, the pleasure of a meal shared, the comfort of familiar faces. These constants connect us across all the intervening centuries. Ancient peoples weren't aliens. They were us, living under different circumstances, with different technologies, different beliefs, but the same fundamental humanity. The same desires for safety, for belonging, for meaning, for connection. Understanding this, we bridge the gap. We recognize ourselves in them. We honor their struggles and achievements. We remember. Absolutely. Here's section 13 to extend the script by another 15 minutes. Section 13. The Persian Empire. Let us make one more journey. East again, to the high plateau of Persia. Modern Iran. Here arose one of the ancient world's greatest empires, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BCE. At its height, this empire stretched from Egypt to India, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, the largest empire the world had yet seen, but also something different, something more tolerant than what came before. Cyrus the Great was a remarkable ruler, not just a conqueror, but a statesman. When he took Babylon, he didn't destroy it. Instead, he respected local customs, allowed exiled peoples to return home. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document, records his policy, tolerance of different religions, restoration of displaced peoples. The Jews exiled in Babylon were allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. This mercy was remembered, celebrated. Unusual in the ancient world, the Persian Empire was organized brilliantly, divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a provincial governor. These satraps collected taxes, maintained order, but allowed local customs to continue, local religions to be practiced. The empire was diverse, containing dozens of peoples, hundreds of languages. The Persians didn't try to erase this diversity. They managed it, channeled it, used it. Communication across this vast empire required infrastructure. The Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles, from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Persia. Way stations were placed at regular intervals. Royal messengers could change horses, rest briefly, then continue. A message could travel the entire distance in about a week, remarkably fast for the ancient world. This network kept the empire connected, information flowing, orders transmitted, problems reported. The Persian capital, or rather capitals, for there were several. Persepolis was the ceremonial center, built on a massive terrace, approached by a grand stairway wide enough for horses to climb. Visitors from across the empire would ascend these steps, heading toward the audience hall, the Apadana, where the King of Kings held court. The Apadana was magnificent, its roof supported by columns 70 feet tall, topped with elaborate capitals, showing bulls, lions, mythical creatures. The walls were lined with relief sculptures, showing delegations from the empire's many peoples, each group dressed distinctly, bringing tribute. Meads in rounded caps, Babylonians in long robes, Greeks, Indians, Ethiopians, all represented, all part of this vast cosmopolitan empire. Persian art celebrated this diversity, but unified it. The reliefs show different peoples, but all moving in the same direction, toward the king, all part of one system, one order. This was the Persian ideal, unity through diversity, many peoples, one empire. This wasn't just propaganda, it was policy. The empire's strength came from inclusion, from allowing peoples to keep their identities while serving the greater whole. Daily life in the Persian Empire varied enormously. A farmer in Egypt lived very differently from a nomadic herder in the Iranian plateau, from a merchant in Babylon, from a craftsman in Sardis, but all were subjects of the same king, all connected through the same administrative system, all protected by the same armies. In the Persian heartland, life retained older patterns. Some Persians were nomadic, moving with herds, sheep, goats, horses. The Persian relationship with horses was special. They were master horsemen. Cavalry was central to their military, but horses were also prestige, wealth, beauty. A fine horse was a treasure. Agriculture in Persia required ingenuity. Much of the land was arid. Water was precious. The Persians developed canals, underground channels bringing water from mountains to fields. These required tremendous labor to construct, but once built, they could function for generations, providing reliable water in a dry land. This technology allowed settlement, agriculture, civilization in challenging environments. The Persian diet was simple but satisfying. Bread, the foundation of every meal, made from wheat or barley. Roasted meat, usually lamb or goat. Stews with lentils and vegetables, onions, garlic, whatever grew locally. Fruits were treasured: pomegranates, dates, figs, grapes. Honey sweetened foods in the absence of sugar. Wine was drunk at feasts, water at other times. For the wealthy, life was more elaborate. They wore fine clothing, wool and linen, sometimes silk imported from distant China, jewelry of gold and silver, precious stones, Pearls especially were prized. Their homes had gardens, the famous Persian gardens, with fountains and pools, trees providing shade, flowers adding color and fragrance. These gardens were paradises, a word that comes from the Persian, meaning a walled garden, an ordered space of beauty amid wilderness. Religion in Persia centered on Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster centuries before the empire. This faith taught there was one supreme God, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, creator of all. Against him stood Angramaniu, the destructive spirit. Life was a cosmic struggle between good and evil, truth and lie, light and darkness. Humans must choose through good thoughts, good words, good deeds. They aligned themselves with Ahura Mazda. Fire was sacred in Zoroastrianism, symbol of truth and righteousness. Fire temples stood throughout the empire, where sacred flames burned perpetually, tended by priests called magi, the same word that gives us magic. Though their practices were religious, not magical, they recited prayers, performed rituals, offered sacrifices of food and precious objects, not animals, for life was sacred. Zoroastrianism had a clear moral framework. Truth, Asha, was the highest virtue, the lie, drudge, the worst sin. This emphasis on truth shaped Persian culture. Honesty was valued, lying despised. Persian kings prided themselves on being truthful, on keeping their word. This wasn't just personal morality. It was cosmic alignment, choosing the side of the God of truth. The faith also taught about the afterlife. Death wasn't the end. The soul would be judged. Those who had lived righteously, who had chosen truth, would cross the bridge of judgment, Chinvat Bridge, to paradise. Those who had chosen evil, the lie, would fall from the bridge into torment. This was revolutionary. Clear moral judgment after death, reward and punishment. Ideas that would influence Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Children in Persian families were raised with care until age 5. They remained primarily with their mothers. From 5 to 7, with their fathers, learning skills, values. At 7, boys from wealthy families began formal education, often taught by priests. The emphasis was on truth, on righteousness, on physical fitness. Schools were deliberately placed away from marketplaces, lest the dishonesty of commerce corrupt young minds. Persian education valued 3 things especially: riding horses, shooting the bow, speaking truth. These skills defined a Persian noble. Physical prowess, military ability, moral character, all were necessary, all were cultivated. The goal wasn't just knowledge, but the formation of character, of proper nobility. Women in Persian society had significant rights compared to some ancient cultures. They could own property, conduct business. Female merchants were common. They managed estates. Some were quite wealthy. They weren't secluded. They appeared at public events, at religious ceremonies, though Persian society was patriarchal. Women operated within their sphere with considerable autonomy. The empire's economy was sophisticated. Coinage was standardized. The daric, a gold coin, facilitated trade. Merchants moved goods across vast distances. Silk from China, spices from India, papyrus from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, all flowing through Persian markets, through the great trading cities, Babylon, Sardis, Persepolis itself. This was a connected world, an early version of globalization. Artisans and craftspeople held important positions. They created the beautiful objects that filled Persian homes, carved reliefs, fashioned jewelry, forged weapons, made pottery, wove textiles, worked leather. Each craft required years to master. Knowledge passed from master to apprentice. These weren't just trades, they were traditions. Each object created carried centuries of accumulated wisdom. The military was central to Persian power. But it wasn't just Persian. The famous immortals, the king's elite guard, were Persian, but the army included units from throughout the empire, each people contributing their specialty. Median cavalry, Babylonian engineers, Greek mercenaries. This diversity was strength. Different skills, different perspectives, united under Persian command. at night across the empire, from Egypt to India. Fires would be lit in homes, in palaces, in fire temples, each flame a small echo of the sacred fire, the light of Ahura Mazda pushing back darkness. People gathered around these flames, shared meals, told stories. The fire was warmth, protection, connection to the divine, a reminder that light persists even in darkness. The empire lasted over 2 centuries, from Cyrus to Darius to Xerxes, through wars with Greece, through internal struggles, through the constant challenge of governing such vast territories. Then came Alexander, the young Macedonian king, whose armies swept across the empire, defeating the Persians, burning Persepolis. The Achaemenid Empire fell in 330 BCE. But Persian culture didn't die. It influenced Alexander, influenced his successors. Persian administrative systems continued. Persian art and architecture inspired later periods. The Parthians, the Sasanians, later Persian empires, all built on Achaemenid foundations. And Zoroastrianism, though it faded, survives still. A small community maintaining ancient traditions, keeping sacred fires burning, connecting present to past, keeping alive the wisdom of Zoroaster, the vision of Cyrus, the glory of Persepolis. And so our journey through ancient civilizations comes to a close. We've traveled through time, across continents, meeting peoples separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, yet connected by shared humanity, by the universal experiences of being alive, of building, creating, loving, struggling, dreaming. These ancient worlds are gone. The cities are ruins. The languages mostly silent. The faces forgotten, but something remains. In the artifacts they left, in the stories that survived, in the foundations they laid for everything that came after. They live on, echoes in the present, whispers in the ruins. As you drift toward sleep, let these images settle gently in your mind. The Nile at dawn, the straight streets of Mohenjo-Daro, the oracle bones cracking, the lion gate standing eternal, the colossal Olmec heads gazing across centuries, ships crossing dark waters, the ziggurats rising from Mesopotamian plains. These places were real. These people lived, laughed, worked, raised children, told stories, looked up at the same stars we see, felt the same sun, the same rain. They are our ancestors, not just genetically, but spiritually. We are the continuation of their story, the latest chapter in a very long book. Rest now. Let the ancient world fade like sunset, like firelight dimming. There's no need to remember every detail. No need to hold on. Just let the sense of it remain. The deep time, the long human journey, the endless creativity and resilience, the beauty built even in hardship. Sleep comes as it came to them, as it has come to every human who ever lived. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. You're safe. You're part of this long story, connected backward to all who came before, forward to all who will come after, part of something vast and eternal and good. Sleep now. Rest. Dream. Let the ancient voices sing you softly into darkness, into peace, into the gentle country of sleep. Good night.